A painful reckoning is unfolding inside the Democratic Party in the U.S. A candidate who many Democrats had hoped would help them flip control of the Senate this November has quit. Graham Platner of Maine. Platner's campaign has seen many controversies, from his tattoo that resembled a Nazi symbol to more recent reports that he sexted women after his wedding. Reddit posts of his were dug up saying black people don't tip in restaurants. Then allegations that he physically intimidated women, which he denies. And most recently, the allegation that's now ending his campaign, a woman he dated saying he raped her in 2021. Platner denies that allegation, too. The former Marine and oyster farmer said he's pulling out of the race. That's after top progressives ended their support this week. Establishment Democrats, though, have been uncomfortable with him from the beginning. Platner blamed his own party in a fiery 11-minute video posted online. Here's 30 seconds of it.
I think, as many of you know, over the past couple days, I have faced some very serious allegations, and I just want to make it clear, this is all false. The things that have been claimed did not happen. We are suspending campaign operations. This is incredibly difficult because I know that some will think it's an admission of guilt, and it most certainly is not. We're not doing it because of the allegations, we're doing it because of the structures that are being taken away from us by those in power.
Graham Platner there saying he didn't commit rape. He's only quitting because of the powers that be in the Democratic Party. Well, I'll be talking about this with Andra Gillespie, political science professor at Emory University in Atlanta. Andra, good to see you.
Thanks for having me.
So there's a report out now from Politico that members of Platner's team actually begged him to be more gracious in that video, to go out with more gratitude. That clearly didn't work, did it?
Well, that's not what he did. That certainly would have been, I think, the right thing to do given the circumstances. Some would argue that it would have been the ethical thing to do, but Platner made a different decision and decided to make himself the victim. And I am not sure that that is actually going to resonate with anybody. And I think in the long run, it doesn't necessarily bode well for how he will be perceived publicly going forward.
What do you think happened behind the scenes for Graham Platner to finally withdraw?
Losing the support of key allies and supporters, in particular Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont, was something that was certainly fatal to his campaign. If it wasn't that, it certainly would have been poll numbers that, if they had had a chance to be out in the field, and probably would have come out next week, probably would have shown that Platner was losing ground against Susan Collins in Maine in terms of polling. There was polling that came out last week from the New York Times that basically had the race at a statistical tie. This type of negative publicity was something that undoubtedly would have dragged his numbers down. And what was really important here is that in Maine, he had until, I believe, next Monday, July 13th, to drop out of the race if the Maine Democratic Party was going to have a chance to be able to name somebody to put in his place on the ballots. Otherwise, if he had dropped out of the race after next week, his name would have still been on the ballot. And that would have made it even harder for Democrats to be able to gain traction against Susan Collins. So the calendar was of the utmost here. And certainly his own internal numbers probably would have shown that he was in a diminished position relative to Susan Collins in this race had he chosen to stay in.
So you're saying that this was his own decision based on the figures and the numbers, or is it, as he puts it, that the powers that made him withdraw?
You know what? I don't want to parse words about who made him do it. The logical decision, given the allegations that had come out that were cumulative. It's not just that these allegations came out. There had been previous allegations before about how he had treated women. There had been previous allegations about whether or not he had been faithful to his wife. There had been previous allegations about Reddit posts that were bigoted. There was the original controversy about his Nazi tattoo. So it's not like this is the first thing that was coming out of nowhere. This was a snowball effect. And sooner or later, he was going to have to be held accountable for his past behavior. So he could blame it on the outside system, the structure, the establishment coming against him. But I think there has to be a reckoning with, all of these allegations coming out. And he's going to have to contend with, while he has the right to defend himself, I think in the eyes of the public and in the court of public opinion, he's going to have to contend with the fact that so many things had been levied against him. And sooner or later, are they all untrue, or is there a kernel of truth in any of this that could be unsettling to voters, that would diminish his capacity, one, to be able to run successfully against Susan Collins, and then if elected, to be able to serve?
You mentioned a snowball effect. What exactly was he accused of at the end that finally tipped the scales?
The allegations of Jenniy Brasco, so I'm saying her name because she has come publicly forward to say that while they were dating, there were occasions where he was inebriated and forced himself on her, kind of pressured her into having sex against her consent. And so in that capacity, she didn't want to do it. And so therefore, this could be construed as rape or sexual assault. Then after that, another accuser who had previously basically been ignored, in part because people made claims that she was only doing this for partisan reasons because she was known to move in Republican circles, also made additional allegations against him, saying that he stealthily took off a condom during sex multiple times, which in some parts of the world could actually be considered sexual assault, and at the very least should be considered unethical and unsafe. So this, along with the sexting messages to women after his marriage, along with the original reports of bad behavior as a boyfriend, right? All of this suggests that his attitude and his behavior toward women was something that was deeply problematic, and especially shouldn't be tolerated in a Democratic Party that says that it stands up for women.
Right. We've heard all of these allegations. I do want to touch on the fact that he did have a lot of support from a very strong grassroots base, as well as from some of these top progressives like Bernie Sanders. Why did so many people support him until now?
It seemed to be, if we look at sort of the final Senate matchup, and even this, at the end kind of, ends up being a straw man battle because Governor Janet Mills dropped out of the race. Graham Platner was seen as a fresh progressive voice. He seemed like he was somebody who embodied change, and his background as a Marine veteran, as an oyster farmer, gave him a certain type of blue collar street credibility that Democrats were hoping to bank on, to say that they were going to sweep change in away from the staid Republican Susan Collins, who sometimes voted along with President Trump on issues that Democrats certainly disagreed with, and what hopefully Democrats were hoping that Mainers disagreed with. I think the big lesson here is that you can embody change, but we have to ask ourselves, is change for change's sake good enough here? And I think that there are going to be some serious questions about vetting when you don't look carefully into somebody's past, when you don't scrub their and completely look into their social media record. How do we respond to things that come out of people's past? And you can't always say, oh, it was youthful indiscretion. And as serious as I take his experience, you can't blame everything on having PTSD. Sooner or later, there's a character issue here. And so I think that, within the Democratic Party, particularly in the progressive wing, there does have to be a reckoning with tried and true standards of vetting and candidate review before you put candidates forward just because they check off certain types of particular boxes.
And we've seen people in the Democratic Party run away from Graham Platner the same day the rape allegation was published. New York Mayor Zohran Mamdani was asked what he thought of Platner's campaign. Let's have a listen.
I believe that it's time for him to drop out of the race. I think the focus of today should be to respond to the gravity of what so many of us have read. And I think that the only appropriate response is for the campaign to come to an end.
Andra, at least some Democrats, especially more moderates, people to the right of Mamdani, had real misgivings about Platner from the beginning, even as some progressives got behind him. Do you think this moment is going to drive a wedge into the party even deeper?
I think that the fissures that are within the party, from the establishment wing to the progressive wing of the party, are still there. Certainly those establishment figures who publicly expressed caution and were given pause to Graham Platner's candidacy feel vindicated in this particular moment. If we look at, who is vying for the nomination now on the Democratic side, I've heard candidates who are putting their names forward who say, look, we agree with Graham Platner's policies. So in terms of the progressive policy agenda that Platner put forward, I would not be surprised if the eventual Democratic nominee actually ends up espousing some of those progressive policy positions. I think what the establishment wing will now take away from this is the idea of process. And so if there's going to be a fight, it might be a fight between the newer and the older, more experienced consultants about how one should properly vet candidates before we put them forward.
And bearing in mind, once again, that Platner denies the claims of sexual assault against him, Democrats do bill themselves as the party of women's rights, as the party that wants to be on the right side of this. Does the fact that Platner was the candidate until now show some kind of willingness to look the other way when the political stakes are as high as they are in Maine for the Democrats?
So I think that this is a moment of reckoning, not just for elites within the Democratic Party, but also amongst Democratic voters themselves. Because I think it should be noted that some of the troubling allegations against Graham Platner emerged before his primary. And the idea that some of those things could come out, and it looked like in polling and in fundraising that supporters were willing to turn a blind eye to that, is certainly something that people have to sit with. So it's not just the elites who gave endorsements or the consultants who actually pushed forward his candidacy. I think there really does have to be an internal reckoning, not just in Maine, but around the country, about what is the right strategy for dealing with and responding to the Trump administration. Certainly, if Democrats want to respond forcefully to what they disagree with in the Trump administration, that's warranted. But I think that there is a question about whether or not all of the ends justify the means here. This is an instance where it backfired. And perhaps this is a moment where people can decide how far they're willing to go or what they're willing to tolerate, and not say that just because you might see or perceive that Republicans can get away with putting forward candidates who have troubling records on their relationships with women or how they handle finances and other types of things, that means that it's particularly okay for Democrats to be able to get away with the same thing. So I think that there is a time for reflection. Hopefully Democrats will take that opportunity to be able to do so, but they were allowed a course correction here. It's a very painful course correction. It's an embarrassing course correction, but they will be allowed to do it nonetheless.
And DW was on the streets of Portland, Maine a little while ago talking to voters there. Let's hear what they said.
I think everything that we've seen out of Graham Platner thus far has led to sort of this pattern that, has sort of eroded the trust. And, the writing was on the wall. He needed to do that. I'm glad that he did.
I personally think that it should have been addressed way earlier. I think if it was anyone besides a cis white man, then he would have been dropped much sooner in the race, whether it be a person of color, a minority, whatever that looks like.
I really hope that a Democrat or an independent gets in there.
And are you at all upset about the chaos that has surrounded this race?
No, I think it's brought a lot of energy to the race. People are interested in the race.
A lot of energy to the race. So, Andra, what happens next in this Senate race in Maine that Democrats see as essential to their chances of flipping the Senate?
So in a little more than 2 weeks, Maine Democrats are going to have a meeting where they're going to select who the replacement nominee will be, and then that person will go forward to run against Susan Collins. This seat is a must-win seat for Democrats if they hope to gain control of the U.S. Senate. So Democrats need to pick up 4 seats in order to take control of the chamber. Maine was a seat that they were very interested in picking up because Kamala Harris won Maine in 2024. So, and Susan Collins is the last Northeastern Republican who is left in the Senate. So they were hoping that they were going to be able to win that particular seat. They would also need to pick up some other seats. Some of those might be a little bit harder to do, but they were looking to pick up a seat in North Carolina, Ohio, and in Texas as well. If they were able to get all 4, we would be looking at a scenario where Democrats would control 51 seats if we look at the 2 independents who caucus with them and then the other 49 seats. So that's what's at stake. That's why this race is so important.
Speaking of Kamala Harris, her candidacy happened in a way that she was just dropped into the race. Do you see a parallel here? There's going to be a candidate who's going to be basically dropped into this race fairly late. Is this a repeat of what happened with Kamala Harris?
Well, a big difference between that contest and this particular race is there will be a convening of Maine Democrats to have a caucus meeting, basically to pick who their nominee is going to be. So there will be sort of a competitive process where multiple candidates are going to be able to put their hat in the ring, and then they're going to be able to be able to be chosen from members of the party. So that's going to be very different than what happened with Kamala Harris, where Kamala Harris was basically thrust into that position without any type of primary, without any type of convention for expediency's sake. And then it remains to be seen. That's not an apples to apples comparison, but I think people will pay attention to whether or not people feel more comfortable with the Maine Democratic nominee having gone through some type of competitive process before being nominated, as opposed to basically kind of being put up by acclamation through the DNC without any competition that she would have had to go against, which was the case that Kamala Harris had in 2024.
But Andra, it's not going to be a regular primary. It's not going to be regular voters voting. It's going to be delegates of the party. And with Graham Platner having appealed to people who see themselves a little bit outside the traditional structures of the party, do you think that normal voters are going to have the kind of faith and the kind of drive toward this new candidate, whoever it is?
Well, I mean, I still think that's still a big difference. It's a big difference when it is not a foregone conclusion who the nominee is going to be, who's going to emerge from this. That's very different than what happened with Kamala Harris, that basically once it was decided that Kamala Harris was going to be the nominee, other potential names end up kind of dropping out of it. And there wasn't a competitive vote that happened on the floor of the Democratic National Convention. So going through any type of process where there are hundreds, thousands of people who are involved in the process is inherently more democratic from a small d standpoint than basically kind of having the party elites basically pick somebody and not actually seriously give consideration to other people. So I think there's still the possibility for buy-in. It is part of the exigencies of the clock, in terms of like the timetable that they need in order to be able to have a robust general election season.
And zooming out a little, if we take the whole midterm elections, do you think the Graham Platner affair will have an effect on the Democrats' chances in other races?
I wouldn't be surprised if it becomes a talking point in some places. But at the end of the day, those races will be decided by the candidates and the local conditions that are there. So yes, if you pay attention to cable talk shows and you pay attention to the talking points, that's where Republicans attempt to other Democrats. Yes, they're going to raise Graham Platner and support for Graham Platner as an issue. It's probably not going to be top of the mind for your everyday voter in Texas or in North Carolina or in Ohio. In part because if you look at the people who are more vocally supportive of Graham Platner, it's not necessarily those people. And off the top of my head, I mean, I should know, I can't, I don't remember off the top of my head whether or not Sherrod Brown said anything, or James Tallarico or Roy Cooper. But, I think it's important to realize that they're running their own races based on what's happening in their districts. And yes, national conditions matter, but those are still local races, and they're going to be focused on what's happening in their communities and not as focused on what's going on in Maine.
Andra Gillespie, thanks so much for talking to me.
Thank you.
What do you think? Should Democrats have done a better job of vetting Graham Platner? Let us know in the comments. And please remember to like this video if you found it useful. And if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. I'm David Levitz in Berlin. Thanks for watching.